thank you all for coming. So we have two presentations, 15 minutes each. First will be by Michael, and that will be on discourse scaling. So we should be expecting to learn some new things. And the second one will be by Hue, and it will be on food safety, which is very important, and what the producers think, how they behave, how we can improve things. Very important topics, because the big problem with safety and sanitation is that if the people don't see what the problem is, then we can solve it. So that's very important research. So 15 minutes each, and then 5 minutes for presentation, the discussion. Thank you.
My name is Michael Burton. I'm from the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics in the school. And most of the time what I'm doing in terms of research are these non-market valuation techniques, trying to find ways of identifying the way people value things when those things aren't passing through markets. So they could be, that goes from potential products through to environmental policies, through to a whole range of things, really. Anything you want to know how people value. And so one of the emerging things that's coming out is this idea of this technique called best worst scaling. I just want to basically try to give an overview of what it does and how it can be used. So I think it can be used quite widely, and I'm hoping that it might spark off some ideas in people's minds that they might think about ways they could use it in their research. So it's going to be a quick overview rather than any big detail. So conceptual issue, it's a method of generating a ranking of things, of objects. And you use it when you want to quantify the extent of the differences between them and produce a rating or a scale of them. And it's particularly useful when you want to rate a large number of items. Okay, so one of the examples I'm going to use is from an ACR project run out of University of South Australia with 𝒓𝒐𝒏𝒏𝒐𝒏𝒕 𝑬𝒄𝒐𝒏, where it was interested in experts' opinions about how to enhance farm livelihoods. And as part of that, we used this technique. This actually was one where we didn't have a lot of items. The experts all got big sort of previous work to try to work out what the things they thought were important. A set of 8. So these are the ones that they then wanted to rate, with the idea that this should possibly guide where policy should go. So there's the 8 things we'd like to know about. If you're not familiar with this, well, what actually is the choice task that you put in front of people, where you put a subset of your items and you simply ask them to pick out of that subset the most and least. Here it's the most effective, least effective, the best or the worst, whatever that category is. That is just the framing, but I'll probably keep on using the words best and worst. So they just pick. So it's just a binary choice. It's quite simple for the respondent. You don't have to think about a scale or anything. It's just which of these is the best, which is the worst, out of a small set. Obviously, if you only answer one of those questions, it's useless, because you know something about the rating of 2 of them, or the relative ratings, but nothing about the full set, and we can't sort of put a numerical value on the relativity. So we don't ask them one simple question. We ask them, in this example, 8 simple questions. They see a whole panel of these come through. So they need to know that this is what they brought in for. And once you've got that full set, because they're interleaved, you can basically sort of knit together their preferences. Although in one of them, they've only revealed the preferences for those 4 items, but if they've answered a whole sequence of these, you can construct the whole sequence. And that's really what you want to try to get access into. An important thing is, how do you put together that design, that set, in our case of 8? Well, there's something usually come out of these things called BIVITs, balanced incomplete block designs. The designs of more than 2 items per question, so that had 4 in that previous one. It's balanced in the sense that each of the items is going to appear the same number of times. So we've got 8 items, and the co-occurrences between pairs of items is the same. So item 1 will appear with item 2 the same number of times that item 1 appears with item 3, and so on. So it's balanced in that sense. But it's not a complete factorial. A complete factorial would blow out to being massive, and you can't deal with it. But these designs are shown to be quite effective at being able to unpack the sequence of preferences. So how do you analyze this? Well, for those of you familiar with choice experiments and discrete choice experiments, you can just use all the power of conditional logit models, as in it's just a model of choice. trying to explain why they picked an item as best out of a set, and then you flip things over and do it as worst. But you can do it, you just view it as that statistical model. There's some advantage in doing that, because once you go down this route, you can use all of the power and elaboration of any of those statistical models, your random parameter models, latent class models to unpack things into groups and so on. So you can go and play all the usual games that we want to play with those types of approaches. But one of the attractions of this, you can actually just use what's known as the counts. So this is a form which is known as the normalized best worst. You just, for item X, count the number of times that it was chosen as best. Subtract off the number of times it was counted as worst. Divide that through by the number of times it was seen, and that gives you a measure of the value of. So you can do this at an individual level, as long as the people have seen the items enough times, usually about 4. So in our example, we had 8 questions with 4 items. So that means that each item was seen 4 times by each person. You can calculate this measure by individual, so you get individual rankings out of this. So that's quite nice. So I've got counts, or I can do the stats. This is what we get. I think this is for the Nepal data set out of that ACR project. If you just do the logit model, you get just the parameter estimates pop out. You have to normalize by 1, so easier access to modern technology is the baseline, and everything is done relative to that. So access to farm inputs is the highest ranked one, and then you just get the numerical values coming out beneath. So that just pops out as just parameter estimates out of that model. But then you could do the counts in this simple case, and this is just along the horizontal axis. It's the plot of those logit estimates. You can see that's the value with 0. That was our baseline. Along the vertical axis, it's the scores that are generated by the counts, and they just line up. This just recurs pretty much every time anybody does these studies. There is sort of that relationship between counts and the more sophisticated techniques is just near perfect. So you don't need to get embedded in any fancy estimation process in order to retrieve the underlying weights. You can just use the count measures. And there's various different forms of the count measures, but they actually, unless you get to real extremes on the ends where the curvature happens, it just lines up in the middle looking really quite nice. So, a question you might ask is, why not just use Likert questions? This would be the standard way you might think about this. Just you've got your set of objects, you have a scale. So, this is just from strongly agree to disagree to strongly agree. Have a 5, 7, 10-point scale of something, a whole set of items. Just ask them to tick through and do the scaling, and you would just get both a rating, because you'd compare where they are on the scales, and you could sort of, if you're willing to put numbers against those levels, you could talk about where they sit along that line. So there's problems with the Likert questions, which are quite often used. One, people need to maintain consistency in their calibration. I think if you've got 30 of these things coming down, you have to be thinking about the same underlying preference for the item each time you do it. You can't sort of halfway through get a bit bored or whatever, or just shift your focus or something, and just start moving your internal metric as to how you're going to score things, because then there's no consistency in terms of getting those values back. People tend to use different interpretations of the endpoint. So most important, well, what did you mean by that when I met? Don't know. People tend to cluster their responses. So they go down and just pick the number 3 the whole way through. That isn't very useful. And also at times they turn up, say if you're trying to ask them to rate which species are most in need of conservation, say, in terms of threatened species, they just say everything is very important, as in not prepared to actually give any discrimination between items. They're just going to say, almost politically, very important, very important. Don't want to reveal anything about saying, well, actually, this species might be less important than that one. So there's this tendency to actually give you these clusters on the very important. Best worst scaling avoids those, and it's been found to be really consistent, reliable, and it's even been done with young kids. I'm going to do an example where this was a project I was involved with, didn't really run it, but with psychology here and in the UK, this was about trying to get kids to rate faces in terms of the degree of trustworthiness of the face. So that's an important thing in psych, trying to understand what it is that drives people's perceptions as to whether or not a particular face is trustworthy or not. This is the training question they were 5 and 6-year-olds for the kids. So this was the training question. It's a best worst scaling. question. They got 5 items, 5 faces. They had to pick which was the most and least. It was made it a bit of a game. But then once they'd done the training ones, then they were shown real faces out of a standard set of faces presented in a standardized way. And they were asked to sort of score them out of the 5, which is the most and least trustworthy. So there's about 35 kids in each of the treatments, and the same in the adults. It was a repeated study. So the kids went in, they did that task for the best worst scaling. 3 or 4 days later, they came in and did exactly the same experiment, same set of questions. Some did it with the best worst scaling, some did it with the Likerts, and then there was an adult panel on one side doing the same thing. And what's on the vertical axis is a measure of consistency between the scores between the first and the second round of doing. So what you can see is the kids are quite dispersed, as in the sense of, they're not hugely consistent between the two, but in terms of consistency, as in the bar, I think that's the median. The best of scaling are consistently more consistent than the when they were doing the group that was doing the Likert scale. And the same thing's happening to the adults. The adults are obviously more consistent because they're just better at scaling. But we still have the adults, same thing, as in adults more consistent generally, but you get that same differentiation between the best, worst, and the Likert scales. So this is, and the kids, this is 5 and 6-year-olds we're doing this with. So it's sort of, they can process this in a more effective way. Okay, so then you can start doing fun games with this. You can ask the same people about the same item using a different framing. So this is one colleague at 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒂 in Manchester. This is about exposure to E. coli on farms. They want to get experts, 30 interventions they were looking at, so it's a big set. Only 31 experts, so relatively small set, but we can still get information out of them. And they asked us, they had to do those sets of questions, once framed as effective and once assessed as how practical it was. And those two things could be quite different. And this is what comes out when you sort of plot those two things against it. So horizontal axis, practicality, vertical axis, effectiveness. So what you can see is you ideally want stuff in the top right-hand quadrant as assessed as being both effective and practical. So washing hands after contact with animals was pretty practical and quite effective. Vaccinating all cattle, very effective, really difficult to do. Some things quite effective, but simply impractical, as in removing animals that have got the condition out. And something, so you can start playing those nice sort of games. This is one we did for customers of water utilities, and it was one of the public and then one of the managers that tried to map together whether there was a difference in attitudes and preferences towards how they should be managing the business from the perspective of the consumer and the manager. And actually they sort of were turning up quite nicely against each other, aligned with each other to some extent. There's an interesting one that the conservation tariff, the managers didn't think much of that, but the public did think that they would quite like to see tariffs going in and paying more in order to achieve conservation outcomes in terms of the way they're managing the water. So you can start to unpack some interesting things like that. What do the estimates mean? Got these numbers. Well, unfortunately, all you're picking up are these relative weights of objects. They're not absolute values. Because when you're given that choice set, you're forced to answer a question, which is best and which is worst. And you may be looking and saying, they are all horrible. I really don't want any of them, but you're forcing me to classify them between the two. Okay, so you can get relative weights, but you've got no absolute zero associated with it. So this is another one. This is about interventions for Campylobacter. Consumers, there's a set of 30, I think, of these as well. So these are different ways that you could actually implement it to achieve outcomes, and you had to do the most acceptable, least acceptable. A full set of those are being done. But then there's this threshold question that gets added in. And after they've done those sets, they then ask, well, which of these are acceptable and which are just unacceptable? So this is absolute. This isn't anything relative. This is just saying, this approach is unacceptable to me, and there's more down the list. So what that does, when you do the estimation, out pops this thing called the anchor. The anchor is set at 0. That's the bar at which essentially things have cleared the hurdle of being acceptable and not. So what we're seeing is, although they're rated and they're ranked, the last 4 are being deemed as simply being unacceptable as interventions to the consumers. You can see, perhaps not surprising, irradiation, good old chlorine wash for chicken, which nobody likes, which apart from the Americans. This is a UK sample. So not surprisingly, they're really averse to the idea and just say, this is just an unacceptable way of intervening to achieve this outcome. Even if you told me it's effective, we do not want to have a biogun. So you can play some nice games with that. So, summary. It's quite an efficient way of obtaining rankings. It's easy for respondents because it's just these binary choices of small sets. You can use it with small samples of respondents as long as you get them to do enough. You can even get it down to individual rankings. And it's relatively simple to implement. So it's quite a nice way of doing stuff, which we're finding lots of ways of using. I think that's been done. Yeah, thank you.
15 minutes, so thanks. Welcome. Questions for Michael? Sorry?
So thanks, Michael, for that. I think that's very interesting, especially for those of us who work at the studies. Personally, I tend to use lighting scales, but I was wondering whether you have an opinion in regards to the use of just general ranking. Let's say you have a choice of 10, then you ask them, rank which one is the most important for you from 1 to 10. And I know that it's disadvantages when you have a lot of choices, like 20 or 30, that becomes more difficult. But for smaller choices,
I think for smaller choices, you start to see people doing this, say, with 5 or 6 objects. And you think, hang on, you're sort of hitting this nut with a sledgehammer. Really, you probably don't need the technologies. So I think for small sets, you could just do the rankings because you can process that. I suppose those rankings don't give you relative weights. So this will tell you that one object is really way seen as being absolutely the most important, whereas the rankings might not give you a degree of the separation of the items in the list. So that would be the advantage you would get from doing this rather than just doing the ranking. But yeah, I agree. Small sets, as in almost say 8. We're probably getting close to thinking, why do we really need to do it for this? But it was the project came up with that list, and then that was what we went with. But yeah, so yeah, you need it. I would say if 5 or 6, you're probably not.
So online.
Not James, I'm going.
That's really interesting talk, thank you. I was curious though, when you showed the study with the kids and the different Disney characters, how you get them to recognise faces that they are more trustworthy and not. How do you then account for the fact that kids associate Ursula from Little Mermaid as being untrustworthy, and then they have that kind of image in their head of someone who's untrustworthy, and then associate people who look like that as untrustworthy and further.
Yes, okay. So
that preconditioning, I guess.
So have you framed them so that when Cruella de Vil turns up in the photos, that actually they think, oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
I think that's why they probably chose the cartoon characters, because they're sort of fairly extreme in terms of the sets of faces that turning up. But yes, I suppose, but that may just be something which there was nothing saying that face wasn't untrustworthy, but it might be, but that preconditioning might be going over into the real sets. The real sets are just pulled out of these banks of these standard faces. And it could be that by chance there's a Cruella de Vil turning up in that bank, so that the kids will just say, oh, no, she looks like, don't like. So I think, I think.
Ray Stark in my head, for example. Am I
Yes. Well, I suppose, okay.
Yeah.
But in the real faces, they're quite careful. They take the oval. There is no hair. There is no background. As in, if you look at actually the banks of faces that they use, they are very controlled like that, actually, because they're interested in certain aspects. And then they have other measures of what the faces.
So you have 2 online.
Thank you.
It's good. Yeah, interesting.
Okay, so Natasha, you have written on the chat line, and also there is Ram. So maybe Natasha first. Maybe we.
I can ask it out loud if you can hear.
Okay, so Ram, important.
I can bring it up later.
Well, there's no we will get separation on the Likert, but if everybody really thinks they're worth the same, they will start to cluster together in the best worst scaling as well. So it doesn't force there to be separation. The question is how you interpret. If they don't show any separation, the question is how do you interpret that? There's a temptation you're going to interpret no separation not as being they think it's all important, but thinking they've answered these questions at random. Because those two things will look identical to me as an analyst afterwards, because they're struggling to differentiate them. They're going to look as if, and random people eventually aren't differentiating. So that's an interesting, if that's the question, that's an interesting issue. Yeah.
There's also one before Natasha.
Yeah. This is called.
Okay, the groups. So what we can do. So this is the idea of whether or not there may be different groups in average that they're cancelling each other out. So that's where you can move to the fancier statistical techniques like latent class analysis, where you just feed it the data and then just say, do I have subgroups within this data that are behaving consistently within the group but different to everybody else? And then that can just unpack how many groups you've got in the data. So you don't impose that, it just comes out of the data analysis. And within the groups, they'll be consistent and outside they won't be. So yes, so that would be, you could do that statistically. You could also, in principle, do that if you've done the individual scores, just to start looking at whether there are clusters and different rankings appearing. But at that point, I would head towards the latent class approaches, which let you group the data endogenously within it. Go on.
So it goes to that point. So you brought up that this simple metric works. First question is, one, are you advocating the simple metric? And if you are, is there a measure of uncertainty? Or despite that, are you actually, so you kind of went into, so we can get more nuance with these, do we still want to treat it in a fancy model? And if you do, does it matter what theoretical assumptions you make around? So you map these things at best worst goes to something, but there's at least 3 different theoretical models for how someone made that choice.
Yes.
And does that matter?
So going down the fancy route, you get some idea of statistical precision. As in, so the numerical one just tells you this is what the ordering is, but doesn't give you any idea as to whether or not it's. You're losing that idea of the precision.
Is that characterized in that metric at all?
In the counts one?
Intuition, you know, like everything is the square root of n.
No, the counts one, I don't think you don't get. Haven't seen anybody, I think, doing any sort of intuition as to what the certainties are from the counts. Different models of how you formed it. Yes, there are different versions, and you can apply the different ideas about what's driving those models. If you're in the statistical world, you can just test as to which one is an appropriate representation of the data.
My just general question is that something to worry about, or in your experience, does it matter and they're all consistent?
You do need to worry about it because it's possible to have people using different metrics for their choice of their best, the choice of their worst. So they're not having consistent utility functions. That's a worry, because what's going on in their heads? And what are you going to use as the scoring? So
just the best.
Well, we've got stuff. I've been talking with Katrina where we can latent class 80% of the sample which being consistent between the two. We can test that, and they're being consistent. And there was a little rump of 20% who were behaving differently when they were answering the worst answers. So yeah, the stats you can dig in and start pulling those things out.
Okay.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my presentation. My name is Hue Vuong, and first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to my supervisors, Professor David Pano, Steve Chilisi, and Associate Professor Michael Burton. So I recently graduated my degree in agriculture economics, and I'm very glad to be here today to talk to you on my topic about food safety in Vietnam, perceptions, behaviors, economics, and policy. In this brief talk, I will present some food safety background information in my country, my research objectives and methods I used in my thesis. I will give you some key outcomes from my thesis and some recommendations to consider. So food safety has become an important problem globally. In developing countries, Africa and Southeast Asia are the regions having the highest burden of foodborne illnesses. In Southeast Asia, there are about 150 million people suffer from foodborne illnesses due to eating unsafe food, and leading to 175,000 deaths per year. In Vietnam, the Ministry of Health reported that between 2011 and 2016, there were over 1,000 food poisoning events relating to over 30,000 people and causing 164 deaths. However, many experts believe that in reality, the true number of cases may be 100 times higher than the official statistics from the ministry. And there has a few studies estimate about the cost of unsafe food in Vietnam. A very tentative estimate from World Health Organization put a finger at over $1 billion per year. In Vietnam, food safety has become the first consumer complaint, and 90% of the Vietnamese consumers are very worried about the safety of food that they consume and its health consequences on themselves as well as on their children. Vegetable and pork are major ingredients on Vietnamese daily diet. On average, Vietnamese people consume 300 grams per person per day. However, 90% of Vietnamese people believe that vegetables were the crops that most likely to be contaminated by chemical hazards and to be health hazard. And pesticide residues is the consumer's greatest concerns due to the exponential increase in the quantity of pesticide used in intensive vegetable farming. In addition to that, the situation of farmers' misuse and abuse of pesticides and even use banned chemicals in vegetable production is commonly documented by studies and reported by public media. And this all have fewer Vietnamese consumer concerns and eroded their trust toward food safety for vegetables. And World Bank 2016 estimate the cost of pesticide residues for vegetable due to losing export opportunity in Vietnam is $450 million per year. Regarding pork, Vietnam is among the top 3 nations having the highest consumption of pork, with 95% of Vietnamese people consume pork. And the average consumption is 30 kilograms per person per year. There are about 30,000 slaughterhouses throughout the country, only 5% of them under the control of government agencies. A recent study reported that 1% of Vietnamese people believe that pork on the market is safe. Food safety concerns for pork including pathogens, residues of growth promoter, heavy metal antibiotic, or slaughtering and shedding disease or dead pigs, injecting forbidden medicine and pumping water into live pigs before slaughters. Vegetable and pork may be contaminated at any stage during the food chains, and the safety of food depends largely on actors, including farmers, retailers, farmers, processors, traders, retailers, consumers, and regulators. For such products as vegetable and pork, contamination most likely to be happen on farms or in slaughterhouses. So it is important to know about the perception and food safety related behaviors of vegetable farmers and pork processors to better control food safety in Vietnam. Besides, in this study, we also investigate the benefits in monetary equivalent terms of Vietnamese consumer from improved food safety in Vietnam. To answer the first question about the relationship between food safety related perceptions and behaviors of vegetable farmers in Vietnam. We face-to-face survey with 319 vegetable farmers in Hanoi and Hưng Yên in the Red River Delta of Vietnam. Principal factor analysis was used to extract factors underlying farmers' perceptions. 4 factors was extracted and named, and then these factors and other important independent variables were included in the partial proportional odd models to investigate the relationship and measure and calculate the marginal change in probability of frequency in which farmers are doing good or bad practices. I would like to give some main finding here. So farmers' behaviors are impacted by their perception, of which the factor of positive perception toward pesticides is the most important factors impact their behaviors related to food safety. The more farmers are in favor of the benefit bring by the benefits of using pesticides, the less likely they are doing properly. So for example, one standard deviation increase in the factor positive perception towards pesticides associated with 9% increase in using a total of pesticides, 4% increase for always using higher dose of pesticides, 9% increase for always using more toxic herbicide, and 12% decrease in compliance with pre-harvest interval time. Regarding the planting method, being safe vegetable or 𝒏𝒄𝒏 has some but limited impacts on good behaviors of farmers. And some farmers, they produce safe vegetable for their family to consume. They use different method compared with the method for their marketed produce. It should be emphasized that these farmers, they are aware of the risk related with their methods used for commercial products, but they have no incentives to reduce those things, except for the produce that they produce for their family to consume. Regarding the pork survey, there are many concerns toward hygiene practices and bad behaviors happening at slaughterhouses in Vietnam. So we face-to-face interviewed with 278 pork processors in 60 slaughterhouses in Hanoi, Hưng Yên, and Hải Phòng in Vietnam. Randomized response technique was used to collect data about some bad behaviors and estimate the prevalent rate of some bad practices in slaughterhouses in Vietnam. Then we use principal factor analysis to extract factors presenting perception of pork processors. Ordinal logis model and logis model were then used to answer the research question about the relationship between food safety related perceptions and behaviors of pork processors. Our result show that perception factors show little impacts on some of behaviors of pork processors. Even many of them participated in food safety training. Food safety training have limited impact on pork processors' behaviors. There are many, our interviews reveal that there may have other factors like financial reasons or the weak oversight of government, especially local government, that the main influence factors than just food safety perceptions. Regarding the bad practices, our findings show that there are no situation of injecting water or banned chemicals into pigs before slaughter them. However, about 17% of the respondents indicated that they had ever slaughtered diseased pig. 19% of them reported that they violated food safety regulation during the slaughtering process, and 20% of them reported that there are no separation between clean and dirty areas of their working place. So there is a mismatch there. The suppliers do not supply the food that the consumer wants. So it is important to know about the consumer's willingness to pay to improve food safety in Vietnam. Discrete choice experiments were used to design the consumer survey. Regarding the vegetable attributes, we include applying pesticides in safe ways, free of growth hormones, using clean water, traceability, and confidence. For pork attributes, we have slaughtering process, disease-free pigs, hormone and drug-free, traceability, and confidence. 314 customers in Hanoi and Haiphong were interviewed. We again use factor analysis to extract factor representing consumers' risk and trust perceptions. And then these factors, along with other independent variables, were included in mixed logic model to calculate the consumer willingness to pay. Our findings show that there is high demand for safe food products in Vietnam, and Vietnamese consumers are very concerned about unsafe food. And this concern translates into a positive, significant price premium for individual food safety attributes. For example, they are willing to pay their willingness to pay 240% more for vegetable produced with the safe application of pesticides, 75% more for hormone and drug-free pork, 70% more for slaughtering process that improve food safety. In addition to that, Vietnamese consumers give high priority for confidence attribute. It means that they prefer to buy food at nearby place. So my thesis has investigated problems from different states, from production, processors, consumption in the food chain. This work contributes to literature in developing countries and provide insights for policymakers to better design food safety in Vietnam. So to improve food safety in Vietnam, there are several actions to be considered. Firstly, to change behaviors of actors to the food chain, education programs such as food safety training, increasing awareness or encourage social responsibility are needed but not enough. To improve food safety, Vietnam needs an economic incentive mechanism to reward for good practice. In addition, better regulation and more effective implementation of sanctions are very important. In addition to that, Vietnamese consumer, they are willingness to pay more to improve food safety for vegetable and pork. But it is important to note that they just play a very important role in transferring their willingness to pay to downstream actors and encourage them to apply more good practices. There are many ways to increase consumer trust, but it's not very easy to apply in the context of Vietnam. One way to increase consumer trust is to increase the capacity of testing system of the government laboratory system, and increase the credibility of food safety certification. Another approach could be that let the private sector like supermarket chain invest in building a brand reputation around food safety. One way they can work directly and deal with the processors and producers and doing marketing. They can invest in testing, traceability, and doing marketing. And in another way, they should demonstrate to the consumers that their food was obtained from the safest producers and processors. So in conclusion, I have to say that there is no immediate solution to solve the problem of food safety in Vietnam. It may be that the solution may appear in the future along with the development of the development of economics and society in my country. So it's about my it's a brief presentation of my thesis. Thank you for your listening.
It's very interesting and very worrying, given the scale. Questions for these kids?
Before you have the good agricultural practice, 𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓,
Yes.
if a farmer followed that, do those practices match with what the consumers value? And is there any understanding in the marketplace yet of what that food safety standard, does that have do people see that standard and say, oh, I know that that has met a high standard of production, or it doesn't work that way?
I think it doesn't work that way, because in the past, Vietnamese government in 2015, 100% of vegetable on the market should be 𝒏𝒂𝒄 certification or state vegetable certification. But until now, I think less than 10% of the vegetable on the market is certificated as 𝒏𝒂𝒄. And there are a lot of problems in Vietnam because it has distrust between actors in the food chain. And for some farmers, as I interviewed with them, in the past they applied 𝒏𝒂𝒄 or state vegetable, but now they changed because they cannot sell their products with high price, and they change to produce conventional one. And even for some people, they said that they produce state vegetable or 𝒏𝒂𝒄, but when I visited them, they did not follow fully the standards. Because the certification is only granted for the whole area, for the place produced vegetable, it's not for the products. So many consumers, they also did not believe about the practice of farmers. So I think it's because of institution issues. Regarding the regulations, I think as World Bank said that in Vietnam we have more than enough regulation, but we have problem with implementation the regulation into place. And because, for example, like we have over 10 million, we have over 4 million pork producers and maybe 10 million farmers, for example, and the production is very fragmented in Vietnam, so it's very difficult to go to inspect them. Even when I interview with officials managing about vegetable production, and they said that they have no resources about human and financial resources to go and inspect the farmers' practices.
Too many.
Yeah. Too many, yes. And it's not only Ministry of Health responsible for managing food safety, then related to Ministry of Agricultural Development and yes, another ministry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think there could be improvements made in public awareness and education campaigns that could help to educate the public on food safety standards? Would that help?
I think it's helpful. It's important to increase awareness and encourage them take more social responsibility. But it's hard because, as I presented from the pork survey, even many of them participated in food safety training, but that did not impact on their behaviors. And many of them, as I interviewed, they said that they are willing to pay for someone else to go for training to take one day off to go there, because for pork industry, the pork processors, they have very high income compared to other sectors.
Yeah. There's a question from Ram online.
So can I ask the question then?
Yes,
yes, please.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Hugh, thank you for the presentation first. My question is about the implementation of food safety standards. You mentioned something that things might happen in the future and it will be improved. So is it the case that the government need to develop capacity in terms of implementing food safety standards on themselves, regulators and so forth? Or is it the case of making consumers much more aware about food safety so that you can achieve the goal? What is the context?
I think the consumer in Vietnam, they're already aware of the food safety situation in Vietnam. As I talked before, over 90% of them are concerned about food safety. And the problem is about, I think, is about the implementation of regulations to manage food safety in my country. And it's hard. And I think every country, they are they're in different stage at the food transformation process. So as a developing country, we have to face this with this stage and hope that in the future we can better manage the problem in Vietnam related to food safety.
Thank you.
Do you want to explain briefly what the randomized response technique is? Because you're asking people about these bad behaviors, so how can you trust that they've told you the right answer? So just explain a little how you actually you dealt with the problem with the RRT.
So
you can say no. That's an interesting question as to how you get people to answer truthfully when you're asking them, have you done a bad thing?
Yes, I think it's very hard to encourage them to review their behaviors. So we use the randomized response technique. We have. So should I quickly discuss about the
very quickly? Yeah.
Yes.
I think it is.
So we use a deck of cards, and then in the cards we have probability of telling the truth or yes or no. If we explain to the processors that whenever they answer the 6 bad behavior questions, they can withdraw 1 card. If the yes appear, they will answer yes, despite the fact that whatever their true behaviors, they have to answer yes. And if they withdraw the no, they will answer no. And if they withdraw the tell the truth, they can say truthfully about their behaviors. So that technique helps them to feel confidential and is not embarrassed in that situation. But I think it's still very hard because some question there is very intermediate. It's very dangerous for their business. So maybe my estimates here still underestimate the true situation. And in addition to that, when we visit the 60 slaughterhouses in Vietnam, we get permission from the government, and we visit one of the best one in Vietnam. So there are a lot of difficulties and limitations. Hope that in the future, if other study, they can overcome that difficulties and the limitation and improve their research.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. For both of you.